I spent about 6 months living alone in a farmhouse while the owner went traveling with his family. It was a small dairy farm in north-central Pennsylvania, small enough that the family of 6 worked it alone with a few part-time hands when needed. The farm was at the center of about 50 acres. They grew their own feed and had some livestock that they used to feed themselves and sell off to a local butcher when needed. The owner was a friend and I was between jobs, so it was nice to just relax for 6 months rent-free and finish the great American novel inside this big, quaint farmhouse with a massive bathtub/jacuzzi, ballroom studio, and a walk-in freezer of food, like an Andrew Wyeth version of the Overlook Hotel. My first encounter with the neighbor who lived 2 miles up the road was when a woman knocked on the door. She was a well-worn 20-something in a shiny pencil skirt and corset with big heels that made it damn near impossible to walk in the wet yard. At the far end of the walkway to the gate, which she left open, was a white Lexus piloted by a well-tanned beef face with dark shades and a mouth that looked like the seam between 2 heavy pieces of brown marble. He looked like the star of an Indian version of the Terminator, at least from his no-neck up. The haggard blonde wobbling on the porch introduced her intentions as though her outfit and vocation were obvious. "The guy up the road paid me to come here and fuck you. You down?" As this was the first conversation I'd had with a real person in 2 days, I admit I stammered a bit in reply. Plus, the way she slurred through her words, I thought she asked if I was Don. "No, I'm Rudy." She just stared for a few seconds as if I would continue telling her about myself and then said, "I don't give a shit. Guy up the road paid me to fuck you, so, where you wanna do this?" She seemed irritated that I was delaying the transaction for a lack of understanding. The man in the car, who I decided was not her boyfriend resisting her demands to ask for fucking directions out of Mayberry RFD, shifted a little in his seat and stared at me. My reaction was to assume this was an attempt to get in the house to rob it, and me. My experiences have taught me that this was a perfect distraction to occupy me while someone else slipped in the back or was going into the barn out back. So I smiled politely and said something like, "Nope. Not interested. Thanks, though." I shut the door and went into sentry mode. I walked the main floor to make sure it was secure, scanned the open yard behind the house and back to the main staircase by the front door, pausing to see that the Lexus was still idling at the curb, the gate was still open, and the woman was yelling something like, "The fucker didn't want it. What do you want to do?" I didn't know if she was talking to the driver or if she had one of them newfangled cellular phones and was asking the neighbor up the road. While they worked things out, I went upstairs to get a better view of the grounds. I snatched up the cordless phone in the main hallway and carried it into each room as I made sure nobody else was trespassing. The yard and farm were clear. Someone started pounding on the front door. Given the meaty thumps, I decided it was the pimpinator coming up with the hard sell for prepaid hooker services. I ignored this until his 5th attempt shook the heavy wooden door in its frame. The house was large enough that it used an intercom system that linked it to all the different rooms, the barn, and the other small buildings on the property. From the kitchen, I activated the comm to the front porch with one hand and prepared to call 911 with the other. "Hey, you know, if you're going to punch my door like that, it doesn't make me think you're a nice person I want inside my house." A moment later, Beef Tits figured out the comm and replied, "Come on, man. If you don't do this, she don't get paid." "She gonna get paid, bro." He punctuated this statement with another round of door percussion that lasted almost a full minute. I replied, "Not my problem. Get gone or go to jail. Stop fucking with the door, bro." One or both of them slammed the screen door so hard, I knew there had to be damage. I looked out into the yard again from the big bay window and saw someone on a small tractor, something the size of a riding mower, heading for one of the chicken coos. This was not a farmer, just some clown in jeans and a polo shirt riding his garden hopper over the grass dragging a small trailer with a cage. So when the 911 operator answered, I described this scene and suggested someone was out to steal my chickens while a prostitute and her pimp were pounding on my front door demanding I let them in. This was a situation that made the operator think I was a drunken, merry prank. However, she agreed to send a cruiser with the kind of lazy commitment that made me glad that Meat Biscuits decided to make an appearance in the window at the back of the house and scream loud enough that I could hear him. The 911 operator could hear him, and even the weirdo on his tractor could hear him a couple of football fields downrange. Pimp Britches noticed I was on the phone and shut up. His head dropped like his spiritual director called "cut," and he walked out of view toward the front of the house. The 911 operator decided this was a legitimate threat and made sure I stay on the call while she sent the entire Mayberry PD my way. I switched to speaker so Pimp Biscuit could hear the dispatcher confirm Andy and Barney were en route, locked and loaded. The weirdo on the tractor casually turned his rig around and headed back where he came from as if on a joyride through the tall grass. I gave as good a description as I could before he disappeared into nearby tree. I guess the hooker was taking a nap in the back of the Lexus, but by the time the local pupo arrived there was nothing left of the pair except the dust their car kicked up gunning it off the property. The police talked to the weirdo on the tractor who was the neighbor from up the road. He did have a small tractor with a cage, but there wasn't much they could do until the Lexus was spotted and stopped a little later. Once Pixie and the beef rolled on my neighbor, the police charged him related to soliciting prostitution which, as a registered sex offender, put him in jail. The guy lived in a small shack at the end of the lane just beyond the farm's property line and he was trying to score chickens. He couldn't pay with cash, so he was going to pay in meth, I understand, which he had in abundance, according to the cops. I told this story to the owner of the house when he called the following day. He didn't seem surprised about his neighbor but the hooking angle left his gasping for I guess because the local puppet didn't want to risk getting things wrong and it turning out that I was an accomplice or a fan of paid sex with strangers, they sent a car around 2 or 3 times every day after, even stopping in to check on me. I got to know the local police pretty well and they were nice guys. But I was an outsider, even though they knew the owner of the house as a good Christian man of strong character, it clearly wasn't a strong enough endorsement to leave me be. Six years ago, in my mid-20s, I lived in a ground-floor flat at the front of the property. Several months after I moved in, a young couple moved into the flat behind me. Kate was 21 and Lottie was 19 and this, for both of them, was their first time living independently with a partner. They were excited and laughing and chatting with me as I helped them shift the last of their belongings. Both worked in caring capacities and they seemed like perfectly sweet, pleasant neighbors to have. It was about 2 months later that I heard the first. Late in the evening, it erupted so fast with such a high volume that my cat was startled from his slumber and leaped a foot in the air. Kate was screaming at Lottie, a vicious, cruel list of insults. I heard Lottie crying, a smash, followed by another, as household objects started hitting the joining wall. I wouldn't say the wall thickness was in any way generous, but it was not so thin to normally allow this level of eavesdropping clarity. The din continued for only another 15 minutes or so. I'll be honest, I wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't so late that it would be reasonable to go around complaining, and I'd be thanked for calling the police if it all sounded worse than it was. I'll also admit that I was afraid that if I called the police, they might well know it was me and I didn't want unnecessary grief in my life. I overthought it, I considered it not my problem. I was relieved it was over fast. A week later another to the next, always accompanied by the sounds of smashing, breaking household items. Kate full of vitriol, Lottie crying. It wasn't my problem. I didn't want grief. Then came the sound of a slap, and another, and a body slamming into that wall. That's when I decided to call the police. There was nothing the police could do. Lottie was bruised with a quickly darkening eye but insisted everything was an accident and there were no charges to press. I thought at least now Kate knew that what she did was not in silence, that others could hear, that the police had been called once and could be called again. But it seemed to make her bolder. The outbursts became nightly, the sounds far more physical and violent. I called the police a couple more times, it was always an accident. Eventually I went over myself in the middle of an episode. I smashed on their door, both of our front doors were exterior to the building. No one answered. I opened the letterbox and shouted at Kate to I shouted until it stopped, but the door remained unanswered. Now I really had identified myself amongst the neighbors as the interferer. My car started being frequently keyed. It was a banger anyway and I didn't own it for its aesthetics, so that didn't bother me too much. I continued to call the police. I started banging on the joining wall as soon as a fight broke out. I started calling out to one or the other. I wrote Lottie a note saying she should run to my flat anytime she needed to, and if I wasn't in then to use a spare key, which I hid in a space near the door. I didn't want the letter intercepted by Kate. Lottie drove, Kate cycled, so I folded the letter and squashed it behind the handle of her car door. It was intercepted. I returned home to find my cat, confused and distressed, tied up inside a number of bin bags, slowly suffocating. There was no damage to my home, but she'd locked in on the thing I loved the most and made her intentions clear. I had to change the locks, I had to hope Lottie would be okay. I moved out shortly after, back into London after this year out in Kent. I never knew what happened afterwards to either one of them. But overhearing endless violence and feeling so limited in how I could stop it made every night a failure, and the growing concern that a death could occur that somehow I should have prevented still haunts me. I hope Lottie got out. I hope she realized, with all of her 19 years, that this wasn't what love is, and that she was worth more than the girl that told her it was. I'm a 51 years old guy and my neighbor is 66 and he's a lorry driver and claims he's in no rush to retire. He shares his house with his 26 years old son. We've been neighbors for 20 years but I've never liked him. He's a busybody, always thinking and looking to what everyone else is doing. A curtain twitcher. But as time has gone on I've discovered he's also a dirty old man. Shortly after I moved in, another neighbor told me one summer he was caught staring at a mom and teenage daughter in their bathing suits in their back garden. Apparently his then wife caught him and a big argument ensued which all the neighbors could hear. I personally have seen him staring at young children in the street. And God forbid if any woman as much as says hello to him he goes into full lech mold. I've bumped into him at our local shop and we're talking and he has twice abruptly stopped mid-conversation to look at women behind me and say out quite loud for her to hear, "So I look at her, wow," making me feel very uncomfortable, let alone her. In my head I said to myself, are you fucking serious? You could not have made yourself any more blatant, you're outright creepy. He did this twice in front of me and the second time I spoke up I replied equally as loud to hopefully somewhat show him up. Jesus Christ, Pete, his name, you're a real pervert, just creepy old man. And I walked away, but I may as well not been there or said anything cause he was totally transfixed on this woman walking past. He seemed like he didn't even notice or register what my reaction to him was, total ignorance. I'm a builder, I'm more than aware of men being alright, my darling, how's you kind of banter as we're known for, but with regards to my neighbor he really is on another level, which is quite concerning. Put it this way, I definitely wouldn't advise him babysitting somebody's daughter. It's not that he's a typical lonely man, I genuinely feel there's something more sinister about him that has always been there. Shortly after I moved in his wife left him. I'm really not joking when I say if ever shocking news comes out about him being some kind of pedophile or sex pest, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. That I try to avoid contact with him as much as possible. And whenever I see it, hear him, I just cringe. When I was a single mom with 3 kids, of necessity, we lived in a really crappy apartment in a seriously crappy complex. At the time, it was all I could afford. I worked 2 jobs, my kids were in school all day. In other words, our apartment was quiet all day long, 5 days a week at least. The people who lived downstairs from us did not work. They slept all day and partied all night. Eventually we learned to sort of sleep through the screamingly loud music and other party noise, the cars coming and going, beeping their hellos and goodbyes, front door constantly opening and slamming shut, laughter, yelling, and as the night went by, screaming arguments and fights in the parking lot. Every morning we went out and picked up the bottles and cans, cigarette and joint butts, used condoms and worse left in front of our apartment. Other than a few attempts at requesting that they keep it down, which was utterly ignored, and a couple of calls in the middle of the night to the police with the same request which was also ignored, we realized that resistance was futile and we stopped complaining. After about a year, I inherited a piano from my grandmother. An ugly old upright with the most beautiful sound and a fabulous touch. I was a classically trained pianist, but at that point in my life I could barely afford my rent. A piano was out of the question, so this was a huge deal to me. Once it was moved into the apartment I couldn't wait to play, my fingers twitched with eagerness. The instant the movers left, I sat down and Haydn sonatas just poured out of me. About 15 minutes in, there is a banging on the floor. Entranced with what I was doing, I ignored it. More banging on the floor. Over and over. One of the kids brought it to my attention. Laughing, I said that at that moment, I just didn't care. They laughed with me and I played on. After about 30 minutes, the doorbell rang. One of the kids answered the door, then called for me. I went to the door. It was the husband of the downstairs neighbors and he is seething with anger. Didn't I realize that they were trying to... On and on he went about how rude and inconsiderate I was. I said nothing. He ranted and raved, threatened and swore. I still said nothing. He finished with this sentence, "We wouldn't mind so much if it was good music," whereupon, I closed the door. Latched it and turned the key, went back to my piano and resumed. This time, Rachmaninoff.